Chess YouTube, what is happening? This right here is one of the best games that Hans Niemann and Magnus Carlsen have ever played versus each other, whether it's online, over the board, you name it. This right here is one of the best games these two titans have ever played in their ongoing rivalry. It's time to relive this epic game from the chess.com servers in July 2024. All right, in the game, Hans Niemann playing as white opens 1e4 and Magnus e5, then knight f3, knight c6, and then finally 3 bishop c4, a surprise to absolutely no one. Hans Niemann being one of the biggest specialists in the Italian opening as white in the game. All right, from here, Magnus, knight f6, the 2 knights defense pressuring the pawn on e4, and Hans, of course, does not go knight g5, the fried liver. Instead, he plays the absolute main line at the highest level. That is simply d3, defending e4 with the pawn. Now, here, the old main move for black is going to be bishop c5, but a lot of black players have been playing bishop e7 instead lately. The idea being you want to castle, go d6, go bishop e6, and so on, challenging the bishop on c4 immediately. But instead, in the game, Magnus here plays the move h6, guarding g5. Now, Hikaru Nakamura has popularized this move order for black in the Italian opening. Let's see what happens. Hans, c3, threatening potentially d4, and Magnus, he doesn't go g5. He doesn't go bishop c5, sorry. Instead, he plays the move d6. Okay, Hans, a4, and then bishop to e7. Magnus, again, avoiding the idea of g5, then g4. That is sort of the main idea here for black, but instead, bishop e7, going for simple development. Now, why would you go bishop e7 and h6 like this? The idea of h6, obviously, you're stopping bishop g5 ideas, but with the bishop on e7, you don't really need to guard this square. Sort of a weird move order. All right, from here, Hans Niemann, he plays the move a5, gaining even more space on the queen side, potentially threatening a6 at some point. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, Magnus, short castles, and then sure enough, Hans Niemann, a6, pushing the pawn all the way to the a6 square. The alpha 0 a pawn completes its journey, and the idea is very simple. If you take the pawn, white takes back, and this does slightly damage black's pawn structure. On the other hand, if you go b6, as Magnus did in the game, then the light squares on the queen side are permanently weakened, and Hans getting a little micro imbalance that he can work with later in the game. All right, from here, Hans Niemann, short castles, and then Magnus, bishop e6. This is black's main idea in the Italian opening sooner or later, regardless of what you do. Regardless of whether you go, say, bishop c5 or e7, at some point in the Italian opening as black, you do want to play the move bishop e6, challenging white's very important Italian bishop on c4 like this. Now, what is Hans going to do? Well, in the game, he actually trades on e6. He takes the bishop, black takes back, and now black has the massive open f-file that he may be able to use later in the game. There are a lot of ideas here. For example, knight h5, then f4 is one idea. Also, you can go, say, queen d7, rook f7, rook a to f8, doubling up rooks. There are a lot of ways to use the open f-file, and beyond that, the pawn on e6, despite being doubled, it does an excellent job of controlling both d5 and f5, and black may even want to go d5 later in the game. So overall, black, despite having these doubled e-pawns, the pawns really aren't that weak, and they may play into play into Magnus Carlsen's strategy later in the game. All right, from here, Hans, knight bd2, very logical, then queen d7, connecting those rooks on the back rank, then rook e1 for Hans. And then here, black has a wide variety of ideas. For example, you can go rook f7, rook a f8 like this. You can also go knight to b8 or d8, trying to reroute this piece to a better square. Instead of those options in the game, Magnus plays the move rook a d8, potentially intending d5 with the rook on the soon-to-be potentially open d-file. All right, from here, Hans, knight f1, logical idea, and Magnus, rook f7, intending potentially doubling rooks on the f-file. Now, we have h3, rook d to f8, Magnus here getting a lot of pressure on the f-file, and Hans Niemann, he's got to find some way to defend. How does he want to do it? Well, in the game, he plays the move knight g3, but this is a big mistake. The problem is black sooner or later can go, say, I don't know, knight h7, threatening the exchange sacrifice on f3, and that exchange stack could completely damage and ruin white's pawn structure on the king side. It turns out actually knight to h7 here for black is the strongest move, again threatening the exchange stack, but instead in the game Magnus, queen to c8 is the move, pressuring the weak pawn on a6. But real fast, backing up to here, instead of knight g3, what is the right idea for white here? Well, it turns out the right move for white is the very cheeky idea, knight 1 to h2, defending f3 with the other knight and potentially intending knight g4 or even g4 later in the game, depending on how the game progresses. Instead, knight g3 was played and Magnus queen to c8, retreating and attacking the weak pawn on a6. Of course, right now it is defended by the rook, but later in the game, that pawn could be vulnerable. All right, Hans, bishop e3, developing. So far, so good. Now Magnus, knight d7, retreating and opening up the attack of the rook on the knight on f3, threatening potentially the exchange stack. All right, Hans, d4, gaining space in the center, a good move. Of course, b4, intending b5, may have been a little bit stronger, but d4 also a very solid move for white. Now black here, he trades on d4. We have e takes, then c takes, and here both sides have this very flexible central pawn structure. Black may want to go e5 or d5. White also may want to go e5 or d5 himself. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Now, Magnus here, he decides the time has come to pressure the very weak, very vulnerable pawn on a6 with the move knight db8. So, knight db8 played in the game, pressuring a6. Hans Niemann, he spots this, queen to e2, defends the pawn, but it turns out he actually missed a very, very opportune moment to play the move d5 here. Turns out d5 in this position is the right way forward and would give white a huge edge in the opening. Instead, queen to e2 was played, and now here, black, knight b4, Magnus tripling up pressure on the weak pawn on a6. Black here is going to win the pawn if he wants it, as there's simply no other way for white to actually defend the pawn. All right, Hans, how will he respond? He plays the move rook e to c1, trying to line up pressure on the c file against the black queen on c8, but black here simply plays c5, counterattacking, and of course, sooner or later, whenever he wants to, he always has the option of capturing on a6, likely with this knight winning the pawn for free. All right, Hans, he's got to make something happen and make it happen fast, as in the long run, that pawn will be lost, and therefore in the long run, Magnus will be doing excellent in this middle game. All right, Hans here, he knows this, and he plays the aggressive idea of e5, gaining space on the king side and in the center. Black in response goes d5, and now here, Hans, we have d takes c5, then b takes, and again, this pawn on a6, sooner or later, it will be lost. So what will Hans do? Well, here, he plays the idea knight to d4. The point being, you cannot take the knight. Well, technically you can, but you lose the queen on c8, therefore not a good idea at all. In response, queen d7. Magnus here finds the best move. He slides the queen out of the attack. Of course, now that knight on d4 is under attack. It may be lost, and white has to move it somewhere. Well, it turns out going back to f3 is actually the right idea here for white. That is just how bad white's position has become. Instead, Hans, he continues fighting with the move knight to c2. Now, the point behind this, he's trying to pressure the weak knight on b4, potentially trading there, but black here, he ignores it, instead plays the move d4 himself, attacking the bishop. Now we have rook d1, pinning the pawn on d4 to the queen on d7. Hans playing excellent, but now knight d5. The knight goes back to the newly vacated d5 square. That is the other idea behind d4. You free d5 for the knight, and that knight is now eyeing a lot of critical squares, including f4, f6, e3, and so on. All right, now the bishop. It's under attack. It has to move. Bishop d2 chosen in the game. And now here, Magnus, he trades on f2. Rook takes f2, winning the pawn and offering the trade. If Hans wants it, he can trade the rook for, win the two rooks for the queen with queen takes, rook takes, and then king takes. However, in my personal experience in my own online games, whenever I trade queens, I always lose within like 5-10 moves. Anytime I give up my queen for the two rooks, I lose within like 5 or 10 moves. So personally, I find it to be way harder to play with those two rooks versus the queen. And Hans Niemann here, he seems to agree. He plays the move queen g4, keeping the queens on the board. Then we have king to h8. Of course, Hans Niemann here in this position, threatening bishop takes h6, winning the pawn and threatening checkmate, as the pawn would be pinned to the king on the g8 square. So king to h8 played, the king slides over, and now knight to h5. Hans Niemann threatening checkmate in one move, but of course, Magnus being the GOAT, he spots this and he goes bishop d8, retreating back with the bishop and defending the pawn on g7. So far, so good. Now, from here, let's slow down and take inventory. Magnus here, he's got two incredibly strong rooks on the f-file. He's got attacking chance against the white king. Overall, everything is going Magnus Carlsen's way. Hans Niemann, his only chance at fighting back in this game is to somehow drum up some sort of attack against the black king, but even that attack is slowly but surely being blocked. All right, from here, Hans, he's got to find some way to counterplay. He plays the move b4, trying to counterattack on the queen side, a decent idea. All right, Magnus, in response, knight c6, pressuring b4 with yet another piece in this game. Now we have b takes c5, and then knight takes e5, winning the weak pawn on the e5 square. And this knight, going from being stuck on b8 here, all the way to e5, attacking the queen, the knight is officially entered the game, and Magnus here, he's starting to steamroll Hans Niemann. All right, here, the queen's under attack. Hans, he sees this. He slides over, takes the pawn on d4 like this. Queen takes d4, but now black, bishop c7, lining up the bishop on this diagonal, pressuring potentially h2 like this. This is not looking good for the future world champion Hans Niemann. All right, queen to e4. The queen slides over, then queen to f7, setting up the Alekhine's gun, aka the Alekhine's battery, with the queen and the two rooks like this, the rook, the queen, and the rook on f2. All right, now, knight g3. The knight drops back, but in this position, Magnus, he's got everything ready. The queen, the two rooks, the knights, the bishop, everything is just begging for a critical breakthrough. And here, Magnus, he finds it. And this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the critical breakthrough for black right here in this position. And the move, of course, right here for black is going to be knight to f3, jumping in with the knight. The point being, if you take the knight here, then bishop takes g3, wins the other knight, defends the rook, and the attack continues. What the heck is white going to do? Well, here Hans, he actually captures on f3. There's simply nothing better. He takes the knight, and now, of course, capturing on g3 is possible, but instead here, Magnus plays the move, rook takes f3, retreating, defending the rook, and also pressuring g3 even more. Now, that knight must move. There's no other way. So, knight e2 played in the game, but now queen to h5. The queen flies in and pressures the weak pawn. Magnus here closing in on his prey. But of course, Magnus here, he has 6 seconds left on the clock versus just the 4 of Hans. Literally anything can happen here in time pressure. All right, white here, queen g4, defending, offering the queen trade. In response, queen to e5. The queen slides over and pressures h2. That would be checkmate on the spot as the rook controls the f-file. In response, we have knight f4. Hans Niemann trying to block the diagonal, trying to defend, but now black, he simply trades on f4. Knight takes f4 is the move. Hans, in response, takes the free rook. Queen takes f3, but here, Magnus, he finds the finishing blow. Knight to e2, checking the king. Of course, if you capture the knight, you lose the queen. Therefore, the king must move. King g2, chosen in the game, but now queen to h2. The queen flies in. The king goes back to f1, king to f1, and from here, it's a simple finishing blow. Rook takes f3, the king slides over, and then finally, queen to f2 is checkmate. Hans Niemann literally getting checkmated in this game by the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a game between Hans and Magnus. In this insane Title Tuesday Blitz game played in, I believe, July 2024. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, comment down below. Who do you love more, Magnus or Hans? I mean, both these guys are fantastic, but surely you have a favorite. So comment down below, Magnus or Hans. Let me know who your favorite is. And if you enjoyed the video, please consider smashing the YouTube like button. It does help me out a ton in terms of reaching more people with these videos. And as always, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.